sort of moment that instilled a lot of fear, because if girls like that, popular, bright, London-born teenagers could be groomed or persuaded into thinking that the Islamic State offered something to them, I think there was a moment where it was clear that it could happen to many women, many young women, if it could happen to them. And I was very drawn to the whole project in part because of how the media in Britain started to cover them. They were very young. They were 15 when they were groomed or recruited, and I think it's really important to use that language of grooming because essentially they were being trafficked or drawn into a group that wanted to marry them off as child brides to soldiers. But the press in Britain wrote about them as though they were already evil. They were written about as whores for the caliphate and concubines, going to service fighters. And there was coverage that really reprimanded state authorities for even trying to find them and get them back. And I remember one columnist saying, it's enough, stop paying attention to these girls. It's time to turn our attention back to our girls. And they were suddenly not our girls anymore. They weren't British anymore. And I felt that this unwillingness to countenance the possibility that they could be victims because they were girls, they were not of age to make a sound decision. Largely, I think, because they were not white. And I wanted to find them and write other headlines about them, and that was sort of part of the quest.
And you write in the book about the failure of systems, really, that let those girls down and let their families down. The police failed to intervene even though there were signs that they should, or they intervened but very ineptly. The school failed to intervene well or properly. Can you tell us a little bit about that, the failure of systems?
It was bewildering to people in the UK that this has happened, because of course there's a very kind of overbearing state policies that are meant to spot signs of radicalization. And they're so overbearing that even I, as a sort of university lecturer, if a young woman in one of my classes shows up starting to cover her hair, I'm sort of obliged to go and speak to her and see if she's been radicalized and maybe her thoughts are turning to violence. So, given all of this, how could it have been missed that these girls were changing, that they were dressing more conservatively, that they were meeting with strangers? It was an incredible lapse. I mean, one of them, in the classroom had started arguing in the secondary school in favor of ISIS, and no one alerted the parents to this. Their best friend, there was a girl who went first, so it's really 4 Bethnal Green girls, but we think of the 3. She was a strong personality. She went first, and the police knew, and the school knew, and everyone knew, but no one told the parents of these 3 best friends. They just said, your daughter's friend has disappeared, sort of leaving out the crucial to join ISIS bit of it. So the parents were very much demonized in the press for not having spotted, negligent, what was wrong with them, how could they not have known? And I think the parents were a really poignant part of the story because I think they were largely not really equipped in a way to be parenting girls in the 21st century London in such a fractious moment when this group was sort of spinning out these messages across Tumblr and Twitter and Facebook, and these girls were disappearing into their phones and their behavior was changing, but teenagers disappear into their phones and we don't know what they're doing. But it was blamed on the parents who I think, looked at the girls starting to dress more conservatively, spending more time at the mosque. And these were, immigrant parents of Muslim countries, really worried that they would lose their girls to this kind of liberal society. And so they were actually, like, the signs that they should have been looking for to them were signs of safety and relief. One of the fathers said to me, she had stopped saying, she said to me, Baba, I don't want to be a fashion designer anymore. And I just thought, I was so glad. And, really that should have been the moment when he should have thought, what was she doing? But to him, it was, he misread the signal.
Those girls did leave for Syria after, we really started to know what was going on there. There were images and reports of beheadings, crucifixions, mass rapes. Did those girls not see those reports? Did they see them and not believe them? Or did they see them and think that they were justified?
That's such a hard and important question. Well, so these particular girls, I never had the chance to ask them that question, but I asked other women that question, and got very often a similar range of answers. One was that they didn't believe it, because many of them were living in countries like in Tunisia, where the media was controlled by the state, was used to justify state corruption and brutality and all sorts of abuses in the names of state. And so they either didn't follow, were deeply mistrustful of it, and didn't believe that these things were happening, that it was something that was being deployed to counter what they were starting to think was, a utopian, real project. So distrust in media, even other girls that I spoke to in London, who didn't end up going but were blocked. So I was able to ask them this. They didn't really read or watch. I mean, teenagers barely, read or follow the news as we know it. But with these girls, I think that there was a deep mistrust of it, because part of it, if you looked at the things that the Bethnal Green girls were saying to each other on Twitter, on social media, there was a lot of talk about injustices that the media didn't cover, Guantanamo or the Rohingya, or all sorts of ways in which Muslims were suffering Palestine in ways that the media obfuscated or ignored. So I think that was certainly part of it, but I think we also have to remember that there were different phases. And so women who went earlier in the kind of early period of the Syrian civil war, and really thought that it was a just fight against a very brutal authoritarian dictator in Syria. And then, young women who were hearing from their husbands or their fathers or fighters in Syria and Iraq, yes, we engage in this terrible brutality, but it's because the other side is so extreme as well, that the Assad regime is responsible for industrial scale abuses, and this is what we must do. Everyone's hands are bloody. So a kind of a real sort of, I guess, mix of rejection of the media because of its history of reporting on the state or on citizens, and then this kind of narrative of the opponent is equally evil, and this is justified.
I want to ask you on that note about female anger and female agency. One of my sort of the most poignant passages of the book to me was when you talk about Sharmina, who was one of the Bethnal Green girls, and you say there were many things that a young girl could do with rage, but it took an attentive, intact family, living rooms with books, a sensitive school, and layers of protection that often didn't exist around these working class girls from East London to introduce those ideas. And you say that there was no space in British society for those girls to discuss their anger. Can you tell me what role do you think female anger had in their radicalisation, and why did they channel it to ISIS, which has the violent control of women really at the heart of its project?
I think for very young women, we're talking 13, 14, 15-year-olds. They're just at that moment where their political consciousness is forming. Very often their thinking is quite binary and black and white. Many of them, grew up in families where a sort of a deep mistrust of the West, Western foreign policy, was just part of a cultural and social worldview, and that's something that I related to. So I think in many ways they were sort of very ripely positioned to have this mistrust, these grievances, this political anger exploited by a group that came in. Some of the things that ISIS would say in its messaging, especially to young women in Britain, was, society will never respect you. You'll never really count as British because you cover your hair and you deal with all this racism, and they won't even accept you as feminists because of your religion. So sort of plying all of these messages and sort of increasing their sense of alienation, kind of building it or cultivating it. So I think that there was kind of nascent teenage political anger about things that they had inherited or injustices that they saw, and then kind of mixed in with very real kind of identity dilemmas. Do I count as British if I look like this? Will I be accepted as a progressive feminist? Or one of the things, for example, that was like an ISIS meme that was directed to British young women, was kind of riffing off of CoverGirl, the cosmetic kind of ad. Covered girl, come here and you won't have to deal with any of these choices. Here you can have it all. And of course, it turned out to be utterly a lie. But it was, I think, sort of playing on these frustrations, desires, challenges that, in and of themselves were quite understandable.
This might be a stupid question, but these women obviously went to the caliphate in search of a better life. Was there a brief moment in which they had a better life, or they were able to, have greater freedom of choice in terms of, practicing their religion? Was there any improvement in their lifestyle even for a brief moment?
The women that I wrote about, I would say that not really. That pretty much shortly upon arrival, they realized that there would be, a great deal of coercion, and that many of the things that, ISIS was even teaching them. I mean, when women arrived and went to these guest houses, from which the book takes its title, they had to go on courses of religious instruction and some sort of light arms training. And the religious instruction, it was interesting to me, ended up teaching some of these young women sort of basic Islamic principles that they immediately then turned to say, okay, well, if this is the case, that, if this is a jurisprudence around, this kind of a crime, then every day you're flouting it. So very quickly, I think many of them realized that it was actually not this utopian state-building kind of project in which, Muslims could find a homeland and build a better state than the repressive ones that were on offer, but that it was what we know it to be, a rapacious Syrian, Iraqi insurgency with deeply kind of violent and basically territorially rapacious intentions. But I think the push to then sort of marry again and again also for women was one of the cruelest inflictions. I mean, I think the fact that the minute a woman's fighter husband died, she then had to remarry, sometimes without even having a grieving period. I think overall, it was an intense and an immediate kind of awareness that it was not going to be anything that was promised. And sort of sadly, one of the Bethnal Green girls, I think within weeks of arriving, called home, said, I don't want to be here. It was a terrible mistake. Can you get me out? And her family was trying to find ways to get her out. And she was killed in an airstrike before they could even attempt it.
One of the other really interesting things about reading this book was the difference in experience that the women had based on their background. The Caliphate was an international project. Women from all over the world were there, and they had very different experiences of the regime depending on which country they came from. And there was a bit of a hierarchy that formed, and that bred a lot of resentment, particularly among Syrian women who saw, foreign women come into their country and almost overtake them in the queue, sometimes literally. Can you tell us about that?
That was a really fascinating dynamic, and the first woman who told me about that was a young woman called Asma. I call her in the book. She was one of the Syrian women who was living in Raqqa that I mentioned earlier. She was the one who was studying marketing and she was so cosmopolitan. She could speak some English. She wanted to work in tourism. And her family stayed when ISIS took over the city and started to collaborate, and she was pushed to also, eventually start working with ISIS. And so her role was to go to the border and meet these foreign women who arrived from other countries and bring them in, a sort of meet and greet role. And because she had this English, she was suited for that. I mean, she was the one who first told me, because she had brought in the Bethnal Green girls. She said, I didn't understand why they were coming here. They were born in London. Why weren't they just staying home and, dating handsome English footballers? Like, why were they coming to our nightmare? Because to her country had just descended into bloody war, and her choices were largely sort of survival-based. And she couldn't fathom why they had come, and then was also very resentful of the privileges that they had. You know, they could go to the front of the queue for bread, or they had a little bit more freedom of movement. And of course, they used that freedom of movement to take pictures of themselves and use it for propaganda and bring more women in. But there was real resentment. You know, they took the better houses. But then you would also hear that from the other side. So all of these kind of real worldly resentments and grievances that you would expect were very much, you know, at play in this kind of in this sort of terribly violent place that